Thanks again to everyone for coming. So we left off the last lecture talking about how we might see the organization of values in a pluralist kind of way versus a monist kind of way, not just as a metaphysical question, but also as a question you could study socially, as what anthropologists would call an empirical question, something you could go out and gather data about. And we left off, or I left off anyway, talking about the possibility that there was a continuum between sort of monism and pluralism, and societies were often moving back and forth on this continuum rather than being purely monist or pluralist in how they organize values. Now, having said that, last lecture, I do want to say that social scientists, and in particular social psychologists, often in practice treat societies as if they are monist in organization, as if they have one single highest value that organizes the relationships between all the other values. And you have probably heard about the kinds of arguments they make this way if you've heard people talk about individualist societies and collectivist societies. That's a major distinction within social psychology that argues that in individualist societies, the value is placed on the individual, and that's the paramount value. The development of the individual, the ability of the individual to choose to become who they most want to be, et cetera, et cetera. And then the social psychologists will argue, by contrast, in collectivist societies, the good of the social whole, however that whole is defined, whether it's the family or the society as a whole, is the paramount value, and that individuals should be willing to sacrifice some of their own goals and ambitions for the good of the collective, of the whole. Such distinctions really actually do seem to capture broad differences between societies, and so they are useful for comparative purposes. At the same time, people often have the feeling that they're too broad. They're fairly easy to criticize as being very homogenizing, as treating societies as if it's simple to tell whether they're collectivist or individualist or something else. And so within social psychology in particular, but also some other social scientific traditions, this sense that you could characterize societies as having one single highest value and being monist in that regard is quite popular. It is also often criticized. So I think partially the criticisms come from what we talked about last time, is this tension between monism and pluralism that is often present in a social situation, that sometimes they will look very monist, like just the individual or just the collective is the highest value. Other times there'll be more conflict about what's the highest value. So given that it is possible for societies to sort of move around between monism and pluralism, is that kind of approach of talking about a single highest value warranted? Is it a legitimate approach to do things like characterize whole societies as individualist or collectivist? And we'll talk about some other possibilities later. As I treated monism and pluralism last lecture, I think we should treat that as an empirical question, as something we can go out and study. Does it help us understand any particular society to see it as having a single highest, or what social scientists sometimes call paramount value? Or does it obscure more than it helps us see? But I also think that if we slightly reconceptualize the question, it's not so difficult to develop a slightly more subtle approach to this question of what are the highest values that characterize a given society. And this very slight, well, I don't know how slight it is, but the modification I would make is to say, instead of thinking in terms of every society having one single ultimate or paramount value, such as the individual or the collective, it would be useful to think of them as having a number of high-level values, okay? And that it's these high-level values that lend their shape to much of how the society is organized and that determine how things tend to end up in that society. One way you can tell what a society values is by the way things tend to end up. So for instance, in the United States, where I grew up, the market tends to get reproduced. That's how things tend up. Any given individual may feel that they are not interested in the market, they don't want to work toward reproducing it, they may choose professions that they feel aren't heavily market driven, but the society reproduces that over and over again, right? So in some sense, you can say these highest level values, part of how we know they're there is they determine what sorts of social institutions appear again and again and again and don't collapse. I'm taking this notion of high level value from the philosopher Charles Taylor, since he doesn't presume that there's only one value at the top of the hierarchy or near the top of the hierarchy. He more suggests that even if there's one at the top, there are others that are close below it, and that the actual configuration of society is going to be determined by a number of high-level values and the tensions between them. This is his work in the book Sources of the Self. So Taylor preserves this notion that I think is really important, that values are ranked in relation to one another, but he also suggests that even lower ranked values can shape the higher ranked ones. And this gives you these patterns of complexity that make claims that a society is only, say, individualist or collectivist or monist around some other value a little bit suspect. That said, I think that for this lecture, I am actually going to talk in terms of there being a highest value in societies. And I'm going to give as examples societies that look pretty monist in their construction. And I'm doing that because I want to give several examples of different kinds of high-level values that anthropologists have found are able to organize a successful society. Successful in the sense that it reproduces itself, that it endures through time. I don't mean morally successful, but successful in terms of it reproducing itself. And in every case today, I'm going to draw from a lot of work by anthropologists, and if people are interested in the specific works, I'm happy to point you toward them. This is going to be the most anthropological of these lectures. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about how different societies are organized around different values. I hope you'll enjoy it, but it will sound different than the other lectures because I'm not really trying to make a particular argument about values in general, but to talk about what specific values look like. And the high-level values that I want to look at in the course of this lecture are anarchy, or disorder, which turns out to perhaps be a viable value. It's one that we don't have so many studies of, but we do have some, and it's quite interesting. The other is hierarchy itself as a value, a valuation on having there being hierarchical distinctions between people in society. I'll look quickly at individualism. A lot has been said about it, but I'll look quickly at that. And then I also want to look at equality as a value. Not necessarily as an achieved fact, but as a value that you might organize society around. Since individualism is well known already, I'm going to spend more time on the others, and I'm not actually going to put any time into talking about collectivism, because I think that one is probably very well known, but we could talk about it in discussion. So, my point is not that these few different values I'm going to talk about are the only high-level values we can find in the world, but I think these are ones that have been well studied by anthropologists recently. We have contemporary anthropological work on societies organized around these kind of values, so that's why I've chosen them. Does that make sense? All right, so on to some anthropology, and let me start with anarchy. And I'm And I'm drawing on the work of an anthropologist named Judith Scheele, who is German but teaches in France now. And she worked amongst a group of people called the Tubu, T-U-B-U, of northern Chad, the North African country of Chad, who live in a town called Thea, which is a desert oasis in the Sahara Desert. It's one of those places where there's some water, so a town has grown up around it. There's not a whole lot of anthropology written about the Tubu. It's a very hard place to do work. It's very remote and challenging. As you'll hear, it's socially challenging too. But there are plenty of older sort of travelers' accounts and French colonial records that go back hundreds of years. You know, the travelers have been through there and written their memoirs, and then there's the French colonial records from the colonial era. And one thing that's true in all of those writings about the Tubu is that they describe them as anarchic. And what this anthropologist, Judith Scheele, is telling us is that for the Tubu people, anarchy isn't an absence of order or an absence of government. It's not a lack of something. It is something they work to achieve. It is their highest value. They want their lives to be anarchic. And so it's something they positively bring about rather than falling into because of a lack of, say, other kinds of structures. Since anarchy is often treated as, in negative terms, right, as the absence of a state, to make her argument, Scheele ends up redefining anarchy not as the absence of the state, but as the outcome of two other values that are lower than anarchy itself, but that both support anarchy. One of these is a value on disorder itself. They like things to be disordered. And the other is a value on personal autonomy, that people can do what they want and that nobody should tell somebody else what to do. And she goes on to show in detail how these two values of disorder and autonomy guide a lot of social life for the Tubu and help them realize this value of anarchy. So, let me give you some examples of the evidence she points to for the Tubu valuation of disorder. Okay? She tells us, first of all, that in general, Tubu people ignore norms. They know there are norms, there are ways you're supposed to act, but everybody feels very free to ignore those norms. I gather this is a lot like what influencers do in China to get attention, I heard this morning. But those who watch people ignore norms don't sanction or scold them in that Durkheimian way we talked about, but instead find their transgressions of norms funny and entertaining. So people are encouraged to disregard norms because they get a lot of positive attention when they do. And in fact, if you ask a Tubu person what kind of person they'd like to be, they tell you, well, I'd like to be someone who's different and memorable. I'd like to be somebody who other people find odd, and so they remember them. And the way to do that is to act, she translates the Tubu word as outrageously, rather than acting the way you should. Okay? For example, children are taught to disregard norms and be self-assertive rather than to obey the rules that adults might put out for them. So, for example, children go out at night and put scorpions on the seats of cars. They dig holes in the street in the dark so that in the morning, drivers will crash their cars into them. And parents find this behavior hilarious, and they applaud their children for acting in this way. That's not completely, certainly where I did fieldwork in New Guinea, where anarchy is not the highest value, but especially young children, when they're assertive that way, people think that shows they might have a chance to really be leaders when they, when they grow up, okay? Among adults, 99% of people, she did a survey, do not pay taxes, okay? So to realize autonomy, people also don't like to get caught up in relationships that obligate them to others. Divorce is extremely common and doesn't carry any kind of stigma, right? People don't really want to be obligated to a spouse. They also want to avoid the kinds of exchanges that often go on around marriage that help to knit families together. So they practice, they often carry out a practice they call wife capture, where a man and his friends will break in to a woman's house and sort of kidnap her. And that will start the marriage. Now, it turns out that both the wives and the husband's family support this. They think this is a good way to get married because it lessens the obligations between the people involved. If the man was to go formally to the woman's parents and say, I'd like to marry your daughter, and they were to do exchanges together, then they would be obligated to each other in the future. Whereas if it's a kidnapping, then they don't owe each other anything. So they actually conspire to let this happen. Nobody I mean, there are a lot of societies where this kind of kidnapping a woman happens. Mostly it's a bad thing, but amongst the Tubu, it's like, yes, this is a good way to do it because we end up without setting ourselves up with a lot of obligations between others. They also try to avoid reciprocal exchange, which we'll talk about a lot later and is something anthropologists have studied very, very, very extensively, where, you give and then later on you receive back from the same person something else. Because reciprocal exchange also has binding qualities. You certainly know that, right? Somebody gives you a gift, the first thing you know is you're going to have to give them one sometime later, right? They want to avoid that. So they really prefer buying things with money because that doesn't lead to obligations, right? You can buy from one store today and another store tomorrow, and you don't have any obligations. So if you really want to become famous among the Tubu, the ideal is to waste things. Not give them in these kind of reciprocal exchanges that build these kind of bound relationships, but to give them away what Sheila calls pointlessly, rather than use them as gifts to build relations with other people. There's a woman whose example she gives who works in a bank in another town, not in Faya, but sometimes she comes to Faya and stands on a very busy corner and gives crisp new monetary bills to whoever passes by. She just stands there handing out these crisp new bills she gets from the bank. She makes no relations, right? Because she doesn't even know who she's giving them to. It's just whoever walks by, but she's seen as fully realizing the value of autonomy because she just gives to anybody and everybody she wants to. She isn't bound by relationships she has already, and she's one of the most famous people in Tubu, and they really appreciate her as kind of an ideal person, as opposed to maybe as a crazy person, which in some other societies she certainly would be. So for the Tubu then, disorder and autonomy are very high-level values that motivate a lot of their social practices and produce a state of anarchy that they think is a really good state to live in. They think that it's desirable to live in that kind of anarchic condition, and that's how things tend to end up in their society, looking very anarchic. That is a very extreme portrait of a society, but I have to say Sheila is she's done many years of field work. She's a very distinguished anthropologist, so I don't think she's making it up. But I do think we don't find that, well, it's an interesting question. There probably are more societies that value anarchy very highly in the world than we're aware of, partially because they're often very small and they don't do a lot to represent them. Some people say the hill groups of Southeast Asia, the sort of mountain people of Southeast Asia are often organized this way, and that their biggest goal is to sort of escape control by the state and be sort of disorderly enough that nobody can organize them. Okay, so there's one high-level value for you that's neither individualism nor collectivism that has been able to sustain some societies over time, which is a valuation on anarchy. Another very different kind of value is a value of hierarchy, a value of having social relations that are hierarchical. And it's very popular to study this right now in anthropology. It's very popular to study what the anthropologist Sylvia Tidy, who studies sort of regional bureaucrats in Indonesia, to study what she says, places where people turn to hierarchy as a source of hope and a desirable social good. Certainly in an American context, this is almost as surprising as anarchy, because Americans hate hierarchy. The British are a little more in the middle on that one. But certainly in America, this is a surprise. So a lot of American anthropologists study this because it's unexpected. Where hierarchy is a value, people want to live in a system where there's some people who are above them and some people who are below them. And they want to help the people who are below them, and they want to be helped by those who are above them, with the idea that eventually they can move up. And they feel very satisfied living in a world that's organized this way. This makes sense to them as a good kind of life to lead. When I talk about this stuff in England and America, I point out that academics should recognize this, because academia is organized. Marshall Solins, the famous anthropologist, said, academics are fierce egalitarians who live out their lives in extremely hierarchical social settings. Anyway, a lot of recent work on hierarchy as a value has come from work in sub-Saharan Africa, so that's that work I'm going to tell you about now. I mean, you could go to other regions of the world, but it's really booming in that region, so let me tell you about it. There's a classic article, and I think it's one of the most important articles in the last 10, 15 years in anthropology, by an anthropologist named James Ferguson, who teaches at Stanford, called Declarations of Dependence. And he's playing on that founding document of the American government, the Declaration of Independence. Right? Anyway, but he says political philosophy in at least West Africa ought to start with a declaration of dependence rather than a declaration of independence. That is, a declaration that what people have a right to is not a life free of restrictive bonds to other people, above and below them in a hierarchy, something, for example, that the Tubu people really strive for, right? They would hate this. But rather, the declaration should be one in which people have a right to as wide a range of, as possible of opportunities to create these kind of hierarchical bonds. That's what the good life is for a lot of people in West Africa, is having lots of opportunities both to make relations with people above you in one or other hierarchy and people below you. I'm going to give you two strong kind of detailed, I mean, I won't take too long, but two detailed examples of what this looks like. And one comes from the anthropologist Naomi Haynes's recent book called Moving by the Spirit, about the 21st century Bemba people of Zambia in Central Africa. Okay, Bemba people value hierarchy very, very highly, and they work toward building hierarchies of patron-client relations and then moving upward in them, right? So everybody wants a patron above them who helps them and a client below them who they help. And then they try to get more and more powerful patrons, and in that way have more and more followers themselves. Life has changed drastically in the last 80 years for the Bemba. It's got to be one of the more kind of, because the Bemba were a very traditional, rural African community at the beginning of the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, a lot of copper was found on their land, and their area came to be known as the Copper Belt in Africa. And there was lots and lots of mining and lots of money around. They were one of the first ethnic groups in West Africa to become very, very wealthy, but then the copper market cooled off and all of those mines closed down, and now they've become relatively poor. again. So they've experienced a kind of boom and bust. During this set of changes, hierarchy didn't go away. It was there in the traditional society. I really love this, where one of the famous sayings was, the armpit is not higher than the shoulder. The armpit is never higher than the shoulder. That was that was sort of their indigenous way of talking about hierarchy. There are things that are lower and things that are higher, right? So that was it traditionally. And that was usually made with wealth. Bemba society was stratified by wealth, and that would determine who was higher and lower. But when traditionally it was distinguished by birth. It was like a caste system. They did have a king, and the king and the people related to kings were the highest, and then you had the commoners, and then traditionally they had slaves who were captured in war. Then, when all that money came in with the copper belt, the sort of kingship system fell apart, but people began to make these hierarchies with wealth, right? Wealthier people were higher, and et cetera. When the copper boom collapsed and they couldn't build these hierarchies with wealth anymore, they developed an interesting solution, or at least this is Naomi Haynes's argument. Many Bemba now join very small Christian churches in the tradition of the prosperity gospel. Have you guys heard of this? This is the kind of gospel that holds that God wants people to be wealthy on earth. It's an extremely popular form of Christianity in Africa, in Latin America, in America. Way back in his history, Donald Trump sort of comes from the early precursors of this kind of Christianity. Anyway, they join these churches where it's believed that if you pray intensely to God and you tithe regularly, God will reward you with wealth. Because of the tithing, the pastors of these churches are quite rich, and this is seen as an indication of their spiritual power. But the fact is, the members of the congregations don't get similarly rich. You know, God may want them to be wealthy, but they don't all drive Mercedes and the kinds of cars that the pastors drive. Okay? However, when the regular members of these churches don't get rich, they don't give up on the prosperity gospel. Sometimes they'll move to a different church. They'll say, this church, my spiritual patron, the pastor, it's not working for me. I'll try a different one. But they don't give up on the churches themselves, of which there are hundreds. So you can just keep moving from one to another. And Haynes's argument is the appeal of these prosperity churches amongst the Zambian people she studied isn't all about getting rich, because if that was it, it's failed and people should walk away. What it is it's the ability to create and move within spiritual hierarchies now that you can't make those hierarchies out of wealth, right? You can't make the hierarchies out of differences in material wealth like you could during the Copper Belt era. So now you make them spiritually. There are more powerful Christians and less powerful ones, and they build hierarchies amongst themselves. So we can say that hierarchy is still an extremely high value for the Bemba, and I'm just going back to that quotation from Sylvia Tidy. Hierarchy is still a source of hope and a desirable good for them. They want to build a world in which they live in these hierarchical relations. I want to give you another excellent African case, and this one comes from Uganda, and it's the Buganda people. And I'm drawing on the work of a different anthropologist now, China Schurz, and especially her book, Having People, Having Heart. If anybody wants any of these references, I can get them to you. Schurz worked in Uganda in 2007 and 2008, and she studied two organizations that both aim to help orphans and the people who care for orphans. There was a civil war in Buganda in the 1980s, and this was followed by an AIDS epidemic. And this made the problem of raising orphans a really acute problem for the Bemba people. There were a lot of orphans around, and so these organizations were tackling issues. They were charitable. Well, we're going to get into the definition of that, but they were aid organizations that were designed to address a really pressing problem. What interested Schurz about the two organizations she studied is that they went about their work very differently. One of these organizations she calls Mercy House was a long-standing local charity. Mercy House took in orphans and also infirm elderly adults and clothed and fed them, and they could live there, and it looked after their basic needs. Okay? So that was the model of Mercy House, that we're going to directly take care of the orphans and also of old people who've been abandoned. The workers at the other organization, which she calls Hope Child, I mean, these are pseudonyms, insisted, they told China Schurz a lot, that this isn't a charity like Mercy House. They said, we're not like Mercy House. We don't give material items or take care of people in the direct kind of material ways Mercy House does, because the people who ran Hope Child felt this was to treat the people you helped as if they were unequal to yourself, and to breed in them an undesirable kind of dependence. The slang for this in the development world, at least in English, I don't know if, I'm kind of guessing it's found its way into Chinese as well, but is, you don't want to give people a fish, you want to teach them to fish. Right. So Hope Child saw itself as teaching people to fish and saw Mercy House as giving people fish. And so Hope Child didn't want to give any charity. What they did is worked on training grandparents how best to raise the orphan children that ended up being in their care. And they worked to train community members to set up local child development centers for young orphan children so the community itself could look after their development. Okay? So these differences between the two organizations are very recognizable globally and historically, right? Mercy House represents an older model of charitable direct aid in which outside organizations use their resources to directly care for the material and personal needs of the people that they serve. And if you've made these people's lives more comfortable and perhaps more productive than they would have been, then you've succeeded in your work. That's how Mercy House saw its job. Hope Child is a fine example of a much more contemporary model of giving aid, one that aims to achieve what is often called sustainable development, and that's focused on training people that it serves to become independently able to meet their own needs and those of communities in the future, right? So they're teaching them how to fish, not just making sure they have enough fish to eat. For Hope Child, only if it accomplishes the task of making people independently capable of reproducing their own NGO work have they been successful in changing things for the good in the long run, they think, in central Uganda. And crucially then, these workers will have succeeded in reaching this goal without fostering relations of hierarchical authority and dependence with local people. Those are kinds of relations that the people at Hope Child find unpleasant and think characterizes what places like Mercy House build between them and their clients, right? They're not going to be hierarchical. They're going to teach the Ugandan people to be just like them, to be equal to them. In world development circles, Mercy House looks like a relic of a bad colonial and neo-colonial past in which material support rendered people subordinate to and dependent on the help of powerful outsiders to solve their problems. In those same circles, at the time of Schurz's research, Hope Child, which spent only 6% of its budget on tangible goods, which they defined as handouts. In English, that's a negatively marked term. A handout is what you give a beggar, right? It's not really development. Hope Child, in the same circles that thought Mercy House was hopelessly outdated and neo-colonial, Hope Child had a secure place at the cutting edge, realizing the best practices of sustainable development. So as you might imagine, Mercy House struggles along on a very tiny budget while Hope Child is very well funded. the aid world clearly liked Hope Child much more than Mercy House. But how did the Bugandan people evaluate the differences between these two organizations? This is perhaps what's most interesting in Scherz's book. How did which of these organizations did the Bugandan people find more conducive to their success in allowing them to live the kind of lives they defined as good? And the answer to this question Scherz found was very clear. Bugandans were not ungrateful for what Hope Child did for them, but they found the organization to be fundamentally unethical because it did not provide direct material aid to those in need or their families. It clearly had a lot of resources, and it did not give them to those who had less. Mercy House, by contrast, seemed to the Bugandans to be a model organization, deeply ethical in its way about going about things, and a clear asset to their community. They were much happier to contribute their own labor towards sustaining Mercy House than they were towards sustaining Hope Child. The Bugandan evaluation of these two organizations diverged because the definition of the good life for Bugandan people centrally involves the value of hierarchy that we already saw in the Bemba case, or what Scherz calls the value of hierarchical dependence. Okay? An ethical person for the Bugandans responds to the patronage requests of those below them, even as they act as good clients to their own patrons who are above them. And Bugandans feel the world's right when each person has a lot of these kinds of relationships, both up and down, that are in smooth working order. And it's against this background of this model of the good life, of hierarchy as a very high value, that we can understand the Bugandan evaluation of Mercy House and Hope Child. You've probably figured this out already, but I'll say it just to make it clear, make sure it's clear, okay? Both organizations want to help local people care for the orphans in their community, but Mercy House does this by forming enduring patron-client relations with people. The children they care for are their clients quite directly, and the family members who bring orphans to Mercy House and the elderly people who Mercy House also cares for feel they're establishing client relationships with the charity, who they regard as an able patron that helps them care for their own clients, and that they're happy to support by sometimes providing volunteer work as part of their own relationship of hierarchical dependence with the organization. The Hope Child, by contrast, refuses these relations of dependence, right? That's exactly what would be not sustainable. That would be neo-colonial. Instead, it provides training, but it's not geared to building relationships or providing material support for orphans or for anyone else. It comes out of and wants to help to foster a culture of independence, going back to Ferguson's declarations of independence versus declarations of dependence, where everyone can be responsible for themselves. For Bugandans, who value relations of hierarchical dependence as perhaps the most important kind in their social life, Hope Child's refusal of and devaluation of such relations can't help but appear to be unethical in the extreme, aiming as it does to produce an outcome that cannot, in local terms, be considered good. Although the Tubu would be perfectly happy with it, since it doesn't build dependencies and relationships. Sustainable development is more popular in NGO-sending countries, and Hope Child is much better funded than Mercy House, as I said, precisely because Hope Child realizes the high-level value of individualism that's central in most neoliberal societies, rather than this value of dependence. And that leads me to a quick discussion then of yet another sometimes important, very high-level value, which is individualism. Again, this has been discussed a lot, so I'm going to move pretty quickly here. But when individualism is the highest value, the most valued thing is the individual and its liberty, each person's right to become who they uniquely are. Okay? The market is generally the highest ranked domain of society, certainly in neoliberal societies, because it's organized to allow for liberty, for the realization of this highest value. People do whatever they want as long as they can afford it. They can even send themselves to space if they want these days, which sort of blows my mind. But anyway, there's talk about equality as a high value in individual societies, especially equality of opportunity, that everybody should have the same opportunity to become oneself. But it's very much a secondary value, subordinated to liberty. At least in sort of the United States, which is the country I know best, equality of opportunity gets talked about a lot, but almost never implemented. And we can see, if we look at how things end up in individual societies, that there isn't that much equality in evidence within them, but there can be quite a bit of liberty. So again, we could talk about that in much more detail if people want to, but why I wanted to mention that is both to just log a quick look at another high-level value that you certainly find organizing societies around the world, but I also wanted to bring us to this question of what would it be like to live with equality as an even higher value than liberty? What would it mean to make equality the highest value? And I'm going to use my own work on the allotment of Papua New Guinea, who we've talked about already, as a main example. Now, granted, the shift in scale here is pretty intense, right? There are 400 Eurotman people, as opposed to however many people, well, certainly in America, or in all the neoliberal societies of the world. But in a certain way, you can really focus on what equality as a value is like in organizing society by looking at a discrete society that is so small. One interesting aspect of the Eurotman way of life is they put a good deal of time and energy into exchanging exactly equivalent things with each other, exchanging things that are pretty much the same with each other. Most of the time, this happens in an informal way. Every day, Eurotman people go and work in their gardens. They're subsistence gardeners. And on the way back home from their gardens, which are in the jungle, they're walking on these communal paths between the different villages in Eurotman, they'll give most of the people they bump into on the road, they happen to see on the road, they'll reach into their bag and give them either a taro or a sweet potato, which are their two staple crops. And by the same token, everybody they bump into will reach into their own bags and give to them a taro or a sweet potato. In fact, Eurotmen think it's best only to eat food you've been given by somebody else and never to eat your own food. They have two verbs for eating, and one is eating, which means eating food that other people have given you, and the other is eating for nothing, which is eating food you yourself have grown because you haven't given it to anybody else. Now, it's important to note that the crops people are giving each other are the same ones everybody else already has. Everybody grows the same thing, right? And the only way, when crops fail, usually everybody's crops fail, because there's a drought or something like that. So everybody has their own taro and their own sweet potatoes. Nobody is receiving things they couldn't get from their own gardens. But what's important is that they're exchanging with each other. Even husbands and wives will divide their gardens in half so that what a husband gives a wife is a gift, and what a wife gives a husband is a gift, so that a wife doesn't have to eat her husband's food for nothing. That counts as real eating, and a husband can eat his wife's food and it not be eating for nothing. So that's kind of the background. But even more dramatically, Eurotmen often put a great deal of time and effort into exchanging exactly the same thing with each other at exactly the same time. And I don't know what would be an amount of yuan, RMB, that would be hard for anybody to get together on one day. like not what anybody has in their pocket. I mean, when I talk about this in England, I talk about, like, you and I would arrange that I would give you 10,000 pounds, which would mean I would have to go to the bank, I might have to borrow from people. At the same time, and I'd give it to you in 20-pound notes. And at the same time, you would give me 10,000 pounds in 20-pound notes. So we both end up with the same, exactly what we gave, but a lot of trouble went into it because nobody has 10,000 pounds lying around in their house or in their pocket. Now, the most frequent reason the Rotman do these kinds of simultaneous, at the same time exchanges of exactly the same things is to settle disputes. For complicated reasons having to do with theory of mind, but we could talk about that in some other day, there is no way to say I'm sorry verbally in your Rotman. You can't apologize verbally in your Rotman. The way to fix a relationship that's gone wrong is to do this kind of exactly equivalent exchange. And this kind of equivalent exchange is so deeply ingrained as a way of settling disputes that it even introduces the newly introduced, it even comes into the newly introduced state court system that was being developed in Rotman while I was doing my field work. The government had named one particular Rotman person the community magistrate, and he was able to hear hearings to try to settle disputes, okay? And every dispute that came before this magistrate's court, he settled by having the people give exactly equivalent things to each other. The magistrate knew that the government model of the court isn't like this. That the government model is that one person should be found guilty and they should be punished, or which would often mean fined, so that they would give a one-way payment to the party they had injured. So if we were in dispute and I was in the wrong, I would give you 10,000, no, not 10, but I would give you something, right? You wouldn't give me anything. But the Rotman magistrate never ends cases this way. I remember sitting in one case where I knew him also outside of his role as magistrate. And I happen to know that in this particular case, he thought one side was truly innocent and the other side was wholly guilty. So as he went to render his decision, he says, on the side of the government law, I'm quoting him here, it just says that one person pays. If you go to the district office, which is where the smallest level of government in New Guinea is in this region, and it's 6 hours walk away, but if you go to the district office, that's what they'll tell you, that one person is guilty and one person should pay. But he goes on, but I know in my jurisdiction, you will not be in agreement with this, so both of you will pay each other, right? I mean, this is just what makes social life go well in Rotman. And this happens in other very public contexts. Whenever there's a death ritual, huge exchanges get made that are exactly equivalent on both sides. Marriages, similar things happen. So why this commitment to people exchanging the exact same things with each other? One Rotman man who had done a few years of schooling outside of the community had some sense of how market economies work, and he once told me with a smile on his face, and he didn't really speak English, but he had this phrase. He said, these exchanges have no profit. But he says, but we do them anyway. So why do they do them? Well, they do them because they make and maintain relations of equality. That's exactly what they're about, is showing I'm going to treat you exactly the way that you treat me. I'm going to give you exactly what you give me, okay? People do these exchanges then because they make and maintain relationships of equality. And it's the failure to use your food to do this that means making your own food eating for nothing, right? The nothing is that you're not using it to make equal relations with other people who will also be giving you, those aren't exactly simultaneous, but the next time you see them, they'll give you exactly what you gave them. So this is a massive commitment to giving each other similar or the same things. And what it shows is how much the Eratmen define the good as being in equal relationships with other people. They try to bring this about with every exchange they make. Doesn't mean every relationship is the same. I might exchange more goods with you and you with me than I do with him. So there can still be differences. And people who have lots of these kind of equal exchanges become leaders, but they do it by treating everybody equally, such that their means allow, right? One thing that's very bad form, Eratmen, would be to give somebody something you knew they could never repay. If we talked before about how pigs are the most valuable thing in Eratmen. If I knew you had no pig and I gave you a pig anyway, that would be a grave insult, right? Because I would know that you wouldn't be able to repay it. Eratmen are sort of like the Bugandans and the Bemba in valuing relationships very highly. Really, relationships are the thing they value most highly. But unlike Bugandans, they don't like hierarchical relationships. They like relationships where the parties treat each other equally. And indeed, and it's worth knowing this, leadership roles aren't fixed or inherited in Eratmen. This is quite famous for Papua New Guinea. It gets called big man leadership, but leaders change all the time. And even parents really don't have leadership authority over their children. Children in Eratmen can adopt themselves out to other families. They can just walk out of their house and walk into somebody else's house and move in. You know, they kind of share with, they're not so interested in anarchy, but they share with the Tubu an idea that people really should be quite autonomous. That's part of what their equality is about. They're equally autonomous. And there's never been a Eratmen king like there was once a Bugandan king or a Bemba king. The Bemba called them the supreme leader. Leaders are just people who can persuade others to do what they ask at any given moment because they've always treated those other people equally. So you could call both societies, the sort of the kind of Bemba Buganda type and the Eratmen type, places where relations are the highest value. But they value very different kinds of relationships, hierarchical versus egalitarian. Okay. So I've covered 4 kinds of high values here today in this lecture that do produce enduring social lives in which people seem to find life worth living. And you can find plenty of cases of each of these around the world. And so these are anarchy as a very high value, individualism as a very high value, hierarchical relationships as a very high value, egalitarian relationships or relations of equality as a very high value. And again, I called the last 2 forms of relationalism basically a very high value on making and maintaining relations, although they value different kinds of relationships. You could see both anarchy and individualism as values that put individuals over relations, as both values disavow obligations and dependence in favor of people's abilities to do what they want at any given moment. The last lecture I mentioned that philosophical value pluralists treat the existence of different equally good values as a metaphysical, not an empirical question, right? Isaiah Berlin thinks it's true about the nature of the world and the nature of human beings, when you put those 2 things together, that there are a number of good values that you could organize your life around, but that they don't all work together. So you couldn't realize all the good values at the same time. You couldn't be an anarchist and a hierarchical relationalist at the same time, right? That just wouldn't work. But last lecture, I sort of, as an anthropologist, I set aside this metaphysical quest to reframe the existence of pluralism or monism as an empirical question that can be answered differently in each society. Now I want to go back to the metaphysical stance for a minute and suggest that values like anarchy, individualism, hierarchical relationalism, egalitarian relationalism all appear to be really existing values in a metaphysical sense that can support human lives of various kinds. That is to say, they belong in any discussion of what kinds of values might exist in metaphysical and not just social terms. We see them often enough that we have to assume that they are values that bear discussion as being really existing values, and not just, to go all the way back to Peter Berger and from the first lecture, not just socially constructed. I'm going to talk more about this last argument in my paper for the upcoming conference, but my overall argument is that one thing an anthropology of values can contribute to philosophical discussions about values is support for the metaphysical existence of a plurality of values, and the claim that discussions about how people should live going forward ought to take the strengths and weaknesses of all of these high-level values into account in the search for a globally meaningful ethic. I think all of them have strengths that ought to be part of the conversation about what could be an acceptable global ethics. I should say, I don't think anarchy, individualism, egalitarianism, and hierarchy exhaust the number of these values, but in the sense that many metaphysical value pluralists hold, I also don't think there are hundreds of them. I think there may be 2 or 3 more, collectivism being one of them, but that all of those belong in a discussion about what might be a global ethics that could be widely accepted across cultural boundaries. Okay, I don't know how long I talked for, but I'm done. Thanks.